Muna matuƙar godiya. We would like to thank you fervently for this wonderful presentation. I think participants would agree that when you take these presentations together, that of the Emir of Gombe and that of the Emir of Duse, you're really looking at honorable people who are custodians of our traditions and our social values, who are very close to the needs and aspirations of our people. And in both cases, we've heard presentations that are, aimed towards identifying and diagnosing the problems and also coming up with practical solutions, despite the enormous amount of resource constraints that they have, and despite all of the institutional strictures that surround them. We'd like to thank you very much. The next presenter is Mr. Abubakar Suleiman. Mr. Abubakar Suleiman is a seasoned professional with over 20 years of experience working in the financial services industry. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Bank PLC. Currently, his top priority is to optimize the impact of financial intermediation in critical sectors that can catalyze growth and create a future of shared prosperity for all Nigerians. These priority sectors are health, agriculture, education, renewable energy, and transportation. And I think the bank has encapsulated this under an acronym called HEART. HEART as in Kamanzu Chemutin of Sterling Bank. But his current role, before his current role, he served as an executive director and chief finance officer of the bank and was the executive sponsor of the bank's non-interest banking business called Sterling Alternative Finance. Abu, I would like to invite you to present your paper, which will provide a private sector perspective.
Thank you very much, Chairman. The Royal Fathers of the Day, His Royal Highness the Emir of Gombe, His Royal Highness the Emir of Duse, all the heavyweight panelists that are here today. Let me thank you for having me as one of you. I like to think of myself as the outsider in this conversation, as I am the only person providing the private sector perspective. But let me also start by thanking specifically His Royal Highness the Emir of Duse for giving me the courage to go along with the paper that I have presented, because I think the paper that I'm putting forward seeks to be disruptive and deliberately so. I'll start the conversation by encouraging anyone here who has the time to look up, there's a Canadian called Tom Rudnick. He started an educational transformation called Imaginal Education. And the last time I met with him, he said something to me that I have never forgotten. He said, let us not optimize obsolescence. And he said, let us not optimize obsolescence. In his own experience, he found out that we were all seeking to make better things that were already obsolete. And therefore, the battle to achieve outcome was always a lost case because we could not optimize obsolescence. Let me also contribute to the intellectual thought process, even though I have not done the quality or quantity of research that my colleagues have done, by saying specifically that we do not have a religious problem. The challenge with the Almajiranci system of education is not a religious problem. It has been demonstrated that in other places, this system has succeeded in creating education and prosperity for people. We also do not have an ethnic problem. The problem is not a question of whether it is in the northern Nigeria or whether it is a House of Fulani problem. Again, it has been demonstrated that the same problem can be found in other parts of northern Nigeria. We do not have a rural problem because we also see that even in the major cities, that same challenge is faced by parents whose children end up in the Almajiranci system and are also facing the same challenge. It is not a social problem. I don't think it has anything to do with our culture either. So we must be clear the nature of the problem we are solving. Otherwise, we will come at it with the wrong set of solution. And it's not an ideological problem. I primarily think that our problem is an economic problem. And at the root of the Almajiranci or the failure of the system to provide good quality education is a failure or the collapse of the economy on which it is all built. And for as long as the economy is broken, then the system cannot be any better than it is today. And so if you think about it, the close to 400 people who are participating on this webinar today, it's unlikely that any one of them is struggling with the Almajiranci problem within their own immediate family. The chances are that with their level of education, they probably have the economic resources, and with the economic resources that they have, they're able to acquire a combination of both the Western education and the Quranic education they need for a balanced life. I myself was once a student of an Islamic or a Quranic school, and at the same time, a Western school. Unfortunately, not many families can afford to provide both a Quranic education and an Islamic education for their children. So once we agree that it's an economic problem, we must then ask, why is this economic problem so peculiar in the North? Why is this so significant in the North? Because I believe that if the economy of the North had continued to grow the way we started in the 60s and the early 70s, then we would have seen a situation where people are so prosperous that the Almajiranci system would have also evolved with the same level of resources. And so why is this so peculiar in the North? And the origin of that is we did have a conflict of civilization when Western education came to us. And unlike the African system that was completely overwhelmed by Western education, the education system that we already had, that was already centuries old, could not be overwhelmed by Western education. So there was a conflict that was unresolved. And that explains why many of us have to go to two different types of school. The resolution for that is fundamental. Getting to a place where we have a single educational system, and I believe His Royal Highness the Emir of Duse was very specific about how we must also embed that. But the economic problem itself has its roots in oil, and the real price of oil is that because we found a cheaper way of generating revenue, we then found that the local consumption that was what drove local production before was no longer sufficient for us. With oil wells, we felt we could consume the things that we're not yet able to produce. And so the production system in Nigeria started to die out because people moved their resources to buy imported stuff. The car assembly companies in northern Nigeria started to die out. The same thing we saw with the textile industry. And so the real price of oil is that the people in northern Nigeria who produce the primary goods could not earn the quality of living and they could not grow with the economy. But that's not the conversation for today, so I will not spend too much time on that. The issue is what are we going to do about it? Because this is about solving problems. I want to remind everyone here that more than 80% of the resources that this country has today is in the private sector. And that in many cases, the total government revenue is just slightly above 10% of the total resources or productivity or income of the country. So any conversation we have, and we have not actively engaged the private sector or how to pull resources from the private sector into solving the problem, leaves us with very limited resources and the conviction that there is not enough money to solve our problem. So we must bring the private sector to the center of this conversation. I think also that this challenge with private sector has affected northern Nigeria in a peculiar way. When you think about it, a lot of the incredibly brilliant people who go to school in the North, far more percentage of them end up in the public sector than in other parts of the country. And so when you look around in the North, for instance, I work in banking, you realize that the North is financially excluded because banking has not become a fully embedded private sector enterprise in northern Nigeria. You go from there and you move into, take any sector, whether it is law firms, for instance. You find that you're not going to find northern law firms that are in the top 5 or top 10, precisely because a lot of our brilliant people who even read law are practicing in the public sector. And let's not forget that when you go into the public sector, it is a sacrifice. It is a place where people go to sacrifice because you are on a fixed compensation. There is no chance of becoming wealthy in that space. And so a lot of our ability to create wealth that would have been the foundation for reforming our educational system, unfortunately, has not happened. And this challenge, you find it in accounting, you find it in software engineering. So we must understand that the private sector needs to become the center for economic development. And it's the economic development that will enable us to reform our educational system. And so as we move on, let me also say that I do have a few ideas on what we can do and in solving for this problem. The first one is we must go to the root, and the root is not about reforming the educational system itself, because we cannot reform an educational system if we don't have the resources for it. And we cannot have the resources for it if we continue to ignore the private sector that has the capacity to generate that resources. And that means that we must go back to ensuring that our people start to participate more actively in private sector and therefore generate resources. Specifically, I want to talk about the conversation around integrating the Almajiranci system with the Western education. I think that is the single most important job we must do. Not because one is superior to the other, but because education, to my mind, has 4 critical roles that they need to play. The first one is literacy. The basis for any education is you have to be literate. You have to be able to read, to be able to acquire information. And literacy is not just about languages, being able to speak or write, whether it is Hausa or English. It is also about arithmetics or mathematics, being able to understand numbers. It is also as complex as coding, being able to get into the computer space and communicate. So literacy is something that must be embedded in any educational system. And literacy should not be restricted to reading and writing Arabic alone in any school, irrespective of our commitment today. The second,
you've gone so far 8 minutes and 30 seconds. So can you round up, please?
I will round up right away. The second equally important one, apart from literacy, is that we must also have civics or social studies so that people are educated on how to cohabit, how to coexist with other people. And the third one, which is the foundation of Almajiranci, is that people must be taught their faith, their religion, ethics, the things that allow us to exist as complete human beings. But the last one, which we often ignore, is economic education. Any education that does not have a component of economics, unfortunately, will lead people who will come out and not be able to earn a living and therefore perpetuate poverty. So unfortunately, I'm not able to share some of the other action plans, but I do believe significantly that teachers are at the center of the reform, and teachers should no longer be seen as just any individual. There could even be things that are inanimate that provide the same outcome as a teacher. We must invest heavily in the process of teaching, and we must rethink what schools are. Schools should no longer be seen as a physical space. There could be a TV, a radio, a handheld device. Anything that can get educational information to people must now be treated as a TV. And obviously, I support the need for a curriculum review. The curriculum must be changed. Private sector engagement must be. And finally, I think the North needs to come together and put forward a huge financial program where we raise a significant amount of money for a long period of time, anywhere between 20 to 50 years, and where the state commit to committing a percentage of their revenue towards repaying this in the future dates. If we don't put this sort of huge budget dedicated entirely to reforming education on the table, then the conflict of finding resources for the reform would mean that a lot of people will not commit fully to it. So let me end here by saying, again, it all comes down to resources. The resources are in the private sector today. The public sector does not have enough. And to make the private sector participate, the state must come together and raise the money jointly after demonstrating the reform that the money will be funded. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You went on for almost 11 minutes. But that was a very interesting, unique and fresh perspective coming from the private sector. I'm sure it's going to elicit a lot of discussion and debate. I would now like to move on to the next